On the morning of June 27, 1876, General Alfred Terry rode toward the Little Bighorn River with a growing sense of dread. His column had been marching through a silence that felt wrong. No courier from Custer, no distant gunfire, no signal flags cutting the horizon. What they found when they reached the valley was something none of them had language for. More than 200 men, soldiers of the 7th United States Cavalry, lay scattered across the ridgeline and the slopes below it, stripped, mutilated, and bloating under the Montana sun. Among them, at the crest of a hill that would carry his name into every American history book written after that day, was Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. The Army reeled. The nation reeled harder. Custer had been one of the most famous soldiers in America, a Civil War hero, a golden-haired Indian fighter, a man whose legend had been fed steadily by his own pen and by a press that loved his theatrics. His death was not supposed to be possible, not like this, not total, not alone. But one man was not surprised. Frederick William Benteen had been saying something was wrong with George Custer for years, not in the polished language of official reports, and not quietly either. He had said it in letters, said it to subordinates, said it in the kind of blunt, unguarded terms that made powerful men uncomfortable. He had watched Custer make decisions that got men killed, and then watched the Army look the other way, because Custer's victories were useful and his persona was magnetic. Benteen knew what Custer was. He had known for a long time. And on the day the 7th Cavalry rode into the valley of the Little Bighorn, Benteen carried that knowledge with him like something he could not put down. He had earned his opinion the hard way. The winter campaign of 1868 along the Washita River in what is now Oklahoma was one of the defining events of Benteen's understanding of the man he served under. Custer attacked a Cheyenne village at dawn, a village led by Black Kettle, a chief who had spent years seeking peace with the United States government. The attack was swift, chaotic, and technically successful by the military's measure. What followed was less celebrated. Major Joel Elliott, leading a detachment of soldiers, rode in pursuit of escaping warriors and disappeared downstream. When the sound of gunfire from Elliott's direction grew heavy and then stopped altogether, Custer made a decision. He gathered his command, destroyed the village, and withdrew without searching for Elliott's men. He left them. 19 soldiers, including Elliott, had ridden into that riverbank timber and never came back. Their frozen, mutilated bodies were discovered weeks later by another column. Custer's official report treated the matter as a minor ambiguity. Elliott's fate was unknown. The withdrawal was tactically sound. The engagement was a success. Army brass largely accepted this framing. Custer moved on to the next assignment, the next dispatch, the next headline. Benteen could not move on. He wrote a letter, anonymous or so he intended, and sent it to a Missouri newspaper. The letter described the Washita fight in methodical, damning detail. It asked, in language that left nothing to interpretation, how a commanding officer could abandon soldiers in the field. It named what Custer had done without calling it a retreat, because Benteen understood that what happened at the Washita was worse than a retreat. A retreat was a military decision. What happened at the Washita was an officer deciding that the cost of finding his own men was too high, and then filing a report that obscured the calculation entirely. When Custer traced the letter back to Benteen, he confronted him directly, demanding to know if Benteen had written it. Benteen told him, yes, he had written it, and he stood by every word. Custer threatened him. Benteen reportedly told him to go ahead and do whatever he intended to do. No court-martial followed, no official reprimand. The Army absorbed the friction between them and kept moving. But the incident locked something between the two men permanently. They served together, they functioned together when the mission required it, and they hated each other in the specific, irreconcilable way that two men can hate each other when one has publicly accused the other of cowardice and the other has admitted it without shame. What made Benteen's position unusual was not merely that he disliked Custer. Plenty of officers in the 7th Cavalry had complicated feelings about their commander. What made Benteen singular was that his dislike was built entirely on what he considered a matter of military character. He was not jealous of Custer's fame. He did not particularly want fame for himself. He was a competent, unsentimental soldier who had fought well in the Civil War and expected the men he served alongside to hold themselves to something. His grievance with Custer was professional in the oldest sense of that word. He believed Custer was a man who would sacrifice the men under him for personal advantage, and he believed this not from rumor, but from direct observation. That belief did not make Benteen popular. Custer was beloved by a large segment of the American public and protected by friends in Washington. Complaining about Custer too loudly meant inviting scrutiny onto yourself, not onto him. Benteen understood this. He continued anyway. In private correspondence, in conversations with fellow officers, in a general disposition toward Custer that made no effort for concealment. He was not building a case for the record. He was simply a man who had seen something and refused to pretend otherwise. By the spring of 1876, the situation on the northern plains had become impossible to ignore. The Great Sioux War had opened up along the Powder River country, fueled by the government's failure to honor treaty boundaries after gold was discovered in the Black Hills. Sitting Bull had drawn together one of the largest concentrations of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors the plains had seen in a generation. The Army organized 3 converging columns to force the hostile bands back onto the reservation. Custer and the 7th Cavalry were assigned to the column under Terry, moving westward from Fort Abraham Lincoln. The scale of what was gathering in that valley was not well understood by the officers riding toward it. Army scouts had detected signs of a large village. Some estimates suggested thousands of warriors. Custer reportedly dismissed the higher figures, not because he had evidence they were wrong, but because a smaller enemy was a more manageable one, and because Custer, fundamentally, did not believe that any concentration of Indian warriors could stop a charge by his regiment. Benteen had no illusions about what they were riding into. He had scouted these lands. He understood what the sign meant. He expressed his concerns. They were not welcome. On the morning of June 25th, Custer's Crow Scouts spotted the village from the Crow's Nest, a high point offering a distant view of the valley below. They told him the village was enormous, unlike anything they had guided soldiers toward before. Custer pushed forward anyway, partly because he believed the regiment had been spotted and feared the village would scatter before he could engage it, and partly because that was who he was. He divided the 7th Cavalry into 3 columns, assigning Major Marcus Reno to attack the southern end of the village, keeping 5 companies for himself to strike what he believed would be the flank, and directing Benteen with 3 companies to sweep the bluffs to the left, a mission that accomplished nothing except keeping Benteen's companies away from wherever the main fight would develop. Benteen knew it. He carried out the order because it was an order, riding his command through broken terrain that showed no signs of village or warriors, then turning back toward the river when the ground yielded nothing. He was returning when he encountered the regiment's pack train, the supply mules, and was subsequently handed a note that had been scrawled in pencil and sent back by a courier. The note was from Custer. It read, "Benteen, come on, big village, be quick, bring packs." It was the last communication anyone outside of Custer's command received from him. What Benteen rode toward was a disaster already in motion. Reno's battalion had attacked the village from the south, been met by a warrior counterattack of a size that stunned every man who survived it, and had retreated, or broken depending on whose account you read, back across the river and up the bluffs in a rout that cost him 1/3 of his men in a matter of minutes. When Benteen arrived at the bluff line, Reno's survivors were there, disorganized and shaken, and the firing from the direction Custer had ridden was already fading. The debate over what Benteen did next has run through American military history for a century and a half without resolution. He consolidated with Reno. He organized a defensive perimeter on the bluffs. He held through the rest of June 25th and all of June 26th, fighting off attacks that at several points threatened to overrun the position entirely. The men who survived that siege, and most of them did survive, largely credited Benteen with keeping them alive. He moved along the line under fire. He steadied men who were close to breaking. He functioned, by almost every account, with exactly the kind of cold, steady competence that defined him. Whether he could have saved Custer is a question that has no honest answer. By most military assessments, Custer's command was gone before Benteen's companies could have reached him regardless of when they moved. The village was too large, the terrain too broken, the timing too compressed. But the question was asked anyway, loudly and persistently, because someone had to be responsible for what had happened on that ridge, and Custer was dead, which made him inconvenient to blame. The Army's reckoning with Little Bighorn was partly about military failure and partly about reputation management. Custer's widow, Elizabeth Bacon Custer, spent the next 50 years constructing and defending a version of her husband that placed the fault for the battle's outcome anywhere other than with him. She was effective at it. She was formidable, relentless, and completely devoted to a narrative in which her husband had been failed by his subordinates and betrayed by his enemies. Reno was her primary target. Benteen was close behind. The Reno Court of Inquiry in 1879, convened at Reno's own request after years of accusations, produced a finding that technically exonerated Reno of misconduct but did little to clear the air around what had happened. Benteen testified. His testimony was characteristically direct. He described Custer's orders. He described the terrain. He described the decisions that were made and why they were made. He did not perform grief over Custer's death because he did not feel it, and pretending otherwise was not in his nature. What history has gradually come to accept, though it took longer than it should have, is that Benteen was right. Not in the tactical sense of having a superior plan that was ignored. Benteen had no plan to offer before the battle, only a dark foreboding that was not his place to act on. He was right in the deeper sense. He had read Custer's character accurately. He had watched a man make decisions that were fundamentally about personal glory and personal risk tolerance, decisions that treated the men in his command as instruments rather than as soldiers with lives that had value independent of what they could contribute to his next victory. The abandonment of Elliott at the Washita was not an anomaly, it was a pattern. Custer had a history of pushing forward when caution was warranted, of discounting intelligence that complicated his preferred version of a situation, of dividing his force when concentration was the sound choice. He had survived these habits long enough that they had come to look like boldness, which is the specific trick that fortune plays on aggressive men before it finally stops covering for them. Benteen had watched the trick being played and refused to applaud it. That refusal cost him professionally, socially, and reputationally for most of his career. The Army did not promote him to brigadier general until 1890, 14 years after Little Bighorn, and the promotion came with a forced retirement rather than any acknowledgement of what he had seen and said and tried to communicate. He spent his later years in Atlanta, poor and occasionally in trouble. He was court-martialed in 1887 for drunkenness and conduct unbecoming, a charge that carried more than a passing whiff of institutional score settling. He died in 1898. He was never given a medal for Little Bighorn, despite commanding the force that held the bluff position and kept the largest portion of the 7th Cavalry alive through 2 days of siege. There was no national monument to his steadiness, no popular biography, no gilded reputation built from his widow's pen. What he had was the opinion he had always had, which turned out to be correct, and the knowledge that being correct had never been the point for anyone around him. The tragedy embedded in Benteen's story is not that he was ignored. Men with uncomfortable opinions frequently are. The real tragedy is what the ignoring cost. The soldiers who died at Little Bighorn were not killed by superior numbers alone. They were killed in part by a command structure that had tolerated, enabled, and actively promoted a man whose approach to risk was built on the assumption that he personally would survive it. The men under him were not always extended the same assumption. Benteen understood this. He had understood it since the frozen ground along the Washita gave up the bodies of Joel Elliott and his men. He had carried that understanding through 8 more years of service alongside the man he held responsible for those deaths. Watched that man be celebrated and decorated and given command again and again. And then watched the Valley of the Little Bighorn confirm everything he had believed. History eventually comes around to the honest accounting, even when it takes generations. The reassessment of Custer that gathered momentum through the latter half of the 20th century, driven by academic historians, by the perspective of Native scholars and communities, by a general willingness to look at the documentary record without the distorting lens of hero mythology, has steadily moved toward the conclusion Benteen reached decades before any of them were born. Custer was reckless. Custer put his ambitions ahead of his men. Custer, on June 25, 1776, made a series of decisions that a more careful officer would not have made, and the men who died on that ridge paid the price. The man who said so first, loudest, and earliest paid a different kind of price. He paid it in a career that moved slowly through ranks his record should have cleared faster. He paid it in a reputation that was shaded by association with a defeat no one wanted to analyze honestly. He paid it in the specific loneliness of a man who is right about something important and cannot get anyone to listen, not because his argument is weak, but because the person he is arguing against is too famous, too powerful, and too useful to the stories that other people need to tell about themselves. Frederick Benteen was not a sympathetic figure in the easy sense. He was sharp-tongued, difficult, openly contemptuous of men he considered inferior, and he made enemies without apparent effort or concern. But he was honest. In a command culture that ran on flattery, on the careful management of powerful reputations, on the institutional pressure to close ranks around officers whose failures had become inconvenient truths, Benteen said what he saw. He said it in 1868 along the Washita. He said it in the years between. He said it on the bluffs above the Little Bighorn while the dead were still being counted. Nobody believed him until the evidence was impossible to bury. And even then, the monuments went to someone else.